Okay, well, welcome to the Mary Kingsley Medal Award Ceremony. It says the Mary Kingsley Medal and Award Ceremony here, but I'm sure it doesn't mean that. Mary Kingsley was an interesting person who really was the sort of self-made woman, self-taught, self-motivated, and it says here she was a writer and a traveller. But I think travelling was a bit more exciting than it is these days, and certainly she was extremely motivated and spoke to the right sort of people who founded our institute and gave them some very good guidelines about the sorts of things we should do, including the sorts of things we should do in Africa. So I think it's very fitting that in fact we're awarding the medal today to someone who's made an amazing contribution to research in Africa. Kevin, I've known for some time, but I was finding out his biography. There's nothing embarrassing in here because I've not done these before, so I'm not confident enough to actually do the embarrassing bits. But he did his medical degree in Liverpool and did the DTM&H here. He told me that it was actually listening to Ian McGregor talking about malaria that actually gave him the vision about what he wanted to do. And straight away he said he wanted to do immunology and malaria. So that's quite amazing. He went from finishing that to the MRC unit in the Gambia and with Brian Greenwood. And had various trips during that time to the NIH in Washington to work with Lou Miller. But after that, he moved to Oxford and is still, I think, employed by Oxford University as a professor of tropical medicine there. But over the years that he was there, he did two notable things. He employed a rather junior molecular biologist, and he actually started to put together a program for research in Khalifa in Kenya. And in 1989, he moved out there with his family to quite a small start in a few huts in the Khalifa District General Hospital. I don't know if anyone's been out there recently, but it's not a few small huts anymore. It's grown into a really very impressive building, but not just a building. The work that's done there is really international quality. The training offering there is fantastic. I've just come back from doing a viva for one of their PhD students, and I can certainly say that the quality of the student was as good as any that I've seen. In fact, they celebrated the 25th anniversary as Kevin stepped down from being director there, and they had a really good summary of the achievements that had been made. I think it was very evident of the respect that Kevin was held in by all the staff and all the people who've gone through that unit. But what was really impressive was actually the affection that people had for Kevin and all the things that he had done for them. He's given up being director there, but he hasn't given up working. And it's no surprise that the challenge that he took on there in implementing an international quality research and teaching institute has gone on to expand from not just being Khalifa, but the whole of Africa now. And he's putting together with colleagues a platform to accelerate the excellence in science in Africa. And they've had some very good successes recently. He's also chair of the Malaria Policy Advisory Committee in the WHO. And I suspect he also does lots of things in Oxford as well. He's going to talk to us about the subject that he's been working on for many years, on malaria, and he's going to tell us about the global picture of malaria. Is the glass half full, or is it half empty? Thanks, Mary.
Well, thanks very much, Alistair. I realise for people in the audience who don't know, you will be slightly surprised to find out that Alistair is actually junior to me, but and it's so wonderful to be back in Liverpool. I've actually spent longer in Liverpool than anywhere else in the UK, because most of my adult life I've spent in Africa, but in the UK I've spent longer in Liverpool than anywhere else, so I certainly see it as home. I did my medical degree here, and I did the DTM&H here, and as Alistair said, in this very room, and I feel quite envious of those of you who are doing the DTM&H right now. It's one of the happiest memories I have of my entire kind of professional life. And it was very formative. It really was, as Alistair said. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was applying for jobs in Borneo. I was applying for jobs in the British Antarctic Survey. All I knew was I didn't want to be in the UK. You've got to remember this was in Thatcher's time. So I mean, but it really was literally as simple as listening to 3 lectures, which sort of set the whole course of what I've subsequently done. So I'm envious of those of you here, because those who don't know what you're going to do, you might do by the end of the DTM&H. So I'm going to talk about, I have to say also, I'm incredibly honoured to be asked to give this particular talk. As Alistair said, Mary Kingsley was a very interesting woman. It was one of the books I bought when I was in Liverpool originally was her travels in West Africa. And I realised when I was coming up to Liverpool that it's actually on my bookshelf in Kenya, so I had to rush out and buy a paperback copy just to remind myself. I didn't read the whole thing again because it is pretty long and dense, but it did remind me what an extraordinary woman she really was, to do all the things she did at her age, at that time. And I liked several things about her in particular. One was, I obviously looked at the section on diseases, and at the time she was discussing about malaria sort of and the importance of it, and sort of people being warned about the sort of it came from the air and this sort of thing. And she had two very clear recommendations. One was to always sleep under a mosquito net, and the other was to sort of have a really good drink every evening. And I really liked the sort of, I liked her prescience really, because I think certainly the second one I know is very effective. The first one I'm not so sure. So it is a great honour to both be here for the reason I'm here, but also just a great pleasure to be back in Liverpool again and to be back home. And I am going to talk about the global picture of malaria. Malaria obviously is a global problem, found throughout the world in the tropics and subtropics. And I should enter a caveat at this stage. For those of you who are particularly interested in vivax, I'm going to be very disappointing, because I'm going to mostly talk about falciparum malaria, and that's not because I think it's the only problem in malaria, but I'm going to, it gets complicated to try and talk about vivax and falciparum all in one go. But I'm going to talk mostly about falciparum malaria. It is a global problem, but that kind of, we all say that and we all use these kind of maps, but it gives a slightly false impression because, of course, when it comes to where the parasites are, they're not equally distributed. And with these kind of maps, as you know, sort of darker is more and lighter is less. And so you immediately see that in terms of parasite densities and such like, much bigger problem in Africa. But even this doesn't give the real picture, because if you take into account where the people are, not just where the parasites are, you get a different picture, even for falciparum. And that's because there are a lot of people in Asia. So in terms of when you put the parasites and the people together, it's not quite as we sometimes imply that, you know, so this is essentially Africa and then the rest of the world. It's actually a major issue in Asia, and particularly in India. But it still remains the fact that probably around 90% of the total deaths occur in Africa. So a lot of what I say will relate to Africa, but it's about malaria and falciparum malaria in general. It's not restricted to Africa. And the reason why it's children in Africa who die, but in the rest of the world it's all ages who die, is because of immunity. And where you get malaria transmitted to any significant prolonged degree, the population does become immune. And this is a thing which fascinated me so much when I was in Liverpool in 1981. And this, yeah, I've got the point here. This kind of is a sketch of how malaria immunity works in a population. So it doesn't matter what the axis is, it's actually the percent of whatever the maximum you get to for any measurement, as it were, and this is the age of the population. And the point here is that if you look at severe malaria, the kind of malaria that will kill you in green, in an endemic population with ongoing transmission, it's all over pretty quickly. Now, of course, the problem is, that's to say it's relatively unusual to see deaths beyond the age of 5. Now, that may sound pretty quick, but it's not quick enough because, of course, that kind of immunity is brought at enormous childhood mortality. But nonetheless, after the age of around about 5, that ceases to be the issue. You continue to have malaria as a disease, so-called mild malaria, although it's anything but mild, throughout your life, in fact. But again, that gets less and less as you get older. And you continue to be parasitized throughout life. And this is artifactual. This is to do with this sort of, if you like, the sensitivity of the methods of looking for parasites. I don't doubt if you do quantitative PCR, I would imagine pretty much everybody have parasites pretty much all the time in this kind of area. So immunity is acquired over time, and it's acquired first against death and severity, then against clinical disease. Eventually, it limits the density of parasitemia in asymptomatic people, but it's never complete. But this is why, in areas of high transmission, we talk about children in Africa being the ones who die, whereas in the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, there are parts of the world where you do get this kind of immunity, Papua New Guinea, for instance, and parts of India. But for most of the world, this population immunity doesn't build up, and then all ages are susceptible. I'm going to go back to the turn of this century, and at that point, malaria was, we often call things disasters, but malaria really was a disaster, and this term was used by a number of us in writing about it. It was totally out of control. No one had any idea, actually, if I'm honest, how many people died of malaria. I mean, figures were bandied around between 1 and 3 million. It was probably well over 1 million, but it was really very hard to know how many were dying. Massive problem worldwide of drug failure. Chloroquine had been the mainstay of treatment across the world, and resistance spread from Southeast Asia. When it reached Africa, that was an absolute disaster. There seemed to be a complete lack of will internationally to actually tackle this. And it was really, one wondered what would happen next, because it was completely out of control. And in fact, malaria mortality in Africa, so this is malaria mortality in the sort of pre-independence days. So this was the colonial times when there was practically no control in rural areas at all. And then post-independence, it dropped markedly. But by 1990, it had risen back up to as bad or worse as in colonial days, when there was practically no efforts at control in most parts of Africa. So it was totally out of control. And eventually, of course, there had to be some responses, and then there was a whole set of responses really quite quickly internationally, some shown on this slide. Rollback Malaria was formed as what was called a cabinet-level enterprise within WHO, so that it was now thought to be sufficiently important that they need to form a separate, almost organisation. And as those of you who've been involved with it will be aware, it did evolve into what was almost a separate organisation. Then there were a whole set of public-private partnerships began at the same time. I've not listed all of them. Things like Medicines for Malaria, the realisation that we absolutely had to have new drugs. There was the Abuja Declaration by African heads of states, which made a whole set of targets about getting malaria under control. The Millennium Development Goals had malaria as some very specific targets. And then the Global Fund from 2001. And I think at that time, a lot of us were, as researchers often are, were pretty sceptical, because you often hear lots of good words from governments and from international organisations. I think most people felt that really the likelihood of anything dramatic happening was not great. We'd heard all this kind of thing before. But for once, I think those of us who were sceptical really had to eat our words, because what happened following this was quite extraordinary in many ways. This shows the global expenditure on malaria control, and these are in sort of millions, so this is $2.5 billion a year by the time you get up there. I mean, this from 2004, the whole world only spending a couple of $100 million a year, to a point where within a few years it was spending sort of over $2 billion, is unprecedented in terms of sort of international action, finally, belatedly, to do something about it. What did the money go on? Well, it went on all sorts of things, but there were two major things that the money went on. One was good drugs, combination therapy, and again, it doesn't matter what all the colours are on this. This essentially shows the same thing from 2005 to 2013. The total numbers of treatment doses of ACTs supplied, and you have the same story, an exponential rise in the delivery of ACT, effective drugs to replace the failed drugs. And again, every country in the world swapped over to ACT as the first-line treatment remarkably quickly. It's quite hard to change drug policy, but this happened really quite rapidly. The second thing that the money was spent on were impregnated bed nets. Again, you'll be getting used to the sort of... these are all taken, by the way, from the World Malaria Report, which for those of you who haven't seen it, is a really... I don't often say this about WHO publications, but it's a really interesting and good read, certainly for anyone who's interested in malaria, but actually for anybody who's interested in public health. So again, from 2000, bed net coverage in Africa, practically nil. Now, this is incredible. We had known, of course, for many years by then that bed nets were very effective. I mean, no one doubted that. But incredible that sort of in the early 2000s, despite the fact that it was known that bed nets were effective at reducing malaria, were effective at reducing childhood mortality, one of the most effective public health interventions ever, there was hardly any usage. And then, with the investment, it began to rise and rise and rise. To round about 50% coverage now. It depends how you measure coverage. Now you could say, and this perhaps is where the half empty, half full things comes in the title, you could say that's great. 50% of the bed nets that ought to be in Africa are there. Or you could say, that's pretty miserable, really. 50% of people don't have bed nets who should have them. But nonetheless, it was still a remarkable increase. And you would hope that the expenditure of all that money would have done something. And some of you would have seen this paper in Nature, came out online, I think, about 2 weeks ago. It's a great paper. Again, recommend it to anyone to go and take a look at. And this is really comparing the situation in 2000 to now, as it were. And again, the same, I'm not going to go through what the colour scheme is. It's the same as all these colour schemes. The sort of the redder the more, as it were. And this is looking at parasite density distribution across Africa, sort of from an enormous number of surveys and then a sophisticated way of interpolating those data to give an estimate of the parasite density in populations of children right across Africa. And you can see a really remarkable change. And this is thought to have translated into a reduction over that period of by 663 million cases averted, i.e. had this not happened, as it were, had things stayed as they were in 2000, there would, over that 15 years, have been an extra 600 million or so more cases. The confidence intervals, which are obviously also in millions, are wide, and I think one always needs to bear this in mind. We often talk about these kind of figures, and I'll talk about deaths in a minute, and there's a danger of becoming hooked onto them and thinking that they're real figures. They're not real figures, they're estimates, and the confidence intervals are very wide, and I think we always have to remind ourselves of this. But nonetheless, however you look at this, there's been an extraordinary change over 15 years across the whole continent. And if you look now at that put in a slightly different way, across any area, there are places where there's lots of transmission and places where there's relatively less transmission, and that's expressed in malaria terms, in terms of hypo, meso, hyper, and holoendemicity. This is actually rather an old-fashioned classification, but it's quite useful for this purpose. And so that's where your parasite rate goes up from sort of 0 to 100%, i.e. in the population of children, aged 2 to 10, that's where 100% of people all the time have got parasites. And what this shows is what the situation was in 2015 against what it is now across the whole of Africa. And so you see there's been a massive shift to move the highest transmission areas down to moderate or low transmission areas across the whole continent. Really, again, quite remarkable. That particular paper doesn't sort of try and quantify deaths, but the World Malaria Report has done. And then there are various other estimates around. So again, for those of you who follow this, you might wonder, why am I not saying 65% reduction? Because that's the figure that's being thrown around. But in the current WHO malaria report, the estimate was that malaria mortality had been reduced by 47% globally, and somewhat more than that, 54% in Africa. So massive reduction in cases, massive reduction in number of people parasitised at any one time, and a really massive reduction in the death toll, accepting that the estimates of all these numbers are hard to do and inaccurate, but the relative difference is probably right. So there's no reason to doubt that this is what's happened. Oops. And then going back to the recent Nature paper, this is an estimate of trying to work out what was the root cause of this. I mean, I've said loads of money ploughed in, lots of money spent on drugs, lots of money spent on bed nets, some money spent on a few other things, some on indoor residual spraying. So here in the black line is the estimate of what would have happened with no intervention, as it were, across the time period 2000 to 2015, and then trying to model the effect of different interventions. That's indoor residual spraying, this is the effect of good drugs, and this apparently is the effect of bed nets. From which it's concluded that the real driver of this reduction in malaria has been impregnated bed nets. And this is the point in the paper where I realise I'm not reviewing the paper now, but this is the point where I really begin to wonder how well should we, or how confident should we be in this kind of approach and modelling. And I'm going to show you why that is the case. So I'm going to go now to Khalifa on the coast of Africa, where, as Alistair said, I've been based, and some of my colleagues are here today, for a long time. We went to work in Khalifa because there was a massive amount of malaria there. So again, the actual metrics don't matter here. This is the amount of severe malaria in children coming into Khalifa Hospital over time from 1990. So we started work in 1989. And there was a massive amount all the time. And then it went away. To the point where a couple of years ago, it was so unusual to see a case of severe malaria in a child in a hospital where 15 or 20 years earlier, the ward would be literally full of children with cerebral malaria and severe anemia and multiple deaths every day. It went within a few years to a point where it was the sort of thing which you took a visiting medical student to see because they were unlikely to see a case of cerebral malaria in Khalifa. Again, unbelievable change, especially when you watch it happening in front of you. But this is when Bednets came in on a wide scale, and this is when ACTs were introduced, well after the drop. And if you go and look at other indices of reducing transmission, probably the best index of reducing transmission is the parasite rate, so that's the proportion of the population of children who are parasitized and well in the community. And we derive this by looking at the parasite rates in children coming into the hospital with trauma or broken limbs and such like. The parasite rate in the community had been dropping steadily for 20 years. Another index of reducing transmission is a rising age of children with severe malaria. And that's because of immunity. We've said that it's immunity which keeps malaria down into sort of young children. As you reduce transmission, you get less immunity. And as you get less immunity, the age of the child will rise. The average age of children with severe malaria will rise. Here's the age of children coming into the hospital, stays the same. These are children without malaria. This is the age of children with malaria. Again, rising from way, way before the introduction of all these new controls. So there's absolutely no doubt that at least in Khalifa, and we now know this is the case down large areas of the east coast of Africa, there had been a long-term, profound reduction in transmission which predated all the interventions which were taking place. You might say, well, there's something freaky about the coast of Africa. But this is what was happening over in Senegal, on quite the other side of Africa. Similar sort of data from a very long-term study, this time going back to 1984, and showing the malaria-specific mortality this time, because it's in a large demographic system. And you see mortality to malaria rising as drug resistance became a bigger and bigger problem, and then falling away, and a considerable amount of the reduction had taken place before Bednets at any scale were brought in. So the same sort of picture that we see in East Africa. So there really is strong reason to believe that there's something systematic happening in at least some parts of Africa which predates this massive intervention. Now, I need to be careful at this point when I'm talking about it. I always have to stress this. This is not to argue that the interventions have not been important, and it's certainly not to argue that we could afford to reduce them. In fact, we need to scale them up to complete coverage. But it is to say that whatever's happening is getting a helping hand from something we absolutely don't understand. And that's worrying, because if whatever it is decided to turn around and go the other way, it might be not as rosy as we've all begun to think it is at the moment. So I want to talk now about what's happened to overall childhood mortality in these areas as malaria has fallen away. Now, again, I need to be really clear. For the next few slides, I'm just talking about associations. I mean, there's no causal obvious relationship at all, but I wouldn't be talking about it unless I was going to make an argument that there is a causal relationship, which I'll come on to a bit later. So this is what happened to childhood mortality in Khalifa over the same period. Again, what I find an extraordinary thing, childhood mortality dropped by 75% over that period of time. Now, as I say, it could have been lots of things. You could say, well, things are just getting better. There's no obvious way in which things were just getting better. If you go to rural Khalifa now and look at it compared to 25 years ago, it's not obvious how things have got enormously better, but something may have happened. Go and look at, again, back to West Africa, this time to the Gambia. And again, the details don't mind. It's these shapes which matter. This is just different parts of the Gambia, showing the same thing. This is reductions in clinical malaria over this period of time. Same thing happening in the Gambia. Malaria falling away. And what was happening to mortality, overall childhood mortality? Again, in a large-scale demographic system going way back into the 1980s. This is the childhood mortality. falling away over that same period of time, exactly the same as the east coast of Africa, a 75% reduction in childhood mortality. One quite interesting thing on this side, which I always find kind of really interesting, is the biggest fall in childhood mortality seems to have been prompted by a military coup. So and whenever I talk to colleagues from the Gambia, no one can explain this, but it seems that a military coup is pretty good for reducing childhood mortality. So up until now, I've been talking about associations in time of reducing malaria and reducing all-cause childhood mortality. And of course, as I say, you can't draw the conclusion that one leads to the other. I mean, a lot of deaths are due to malaria, but the maximum amount that you would estimate in any area is not going to be above 25% of all the childhood deaths are directly due to malaria. So it can't possibly be that it's the control of malaria which reduces childhood mortality by 75%. But perhaps it can. This is the data, such as they are, for all-cause childhood mortality against prevalence of falciparum malaria across Africa. And you can see that the data are all over the place. You could try and draw a straight line, but it would probably be more logical to imagine this kind of relationship. But whatever the case, it's at least plausible that mortality, child all-cause mortality, is very much higher in places where there's a lot of transmission than where there's little transmission. And if this is not a new concept, people have always argued, going way back, that when you control malaria, actually you get a massive benefit by preventing all sorts of other diseases. So if this were true, let's just imagine it was true for a moment, what would those excessive deaths be due to? Well, they can only really be due to one thing, because to a first approximation, if you die an acute death with a fever in children in Africa, and it's not malaria, it can only really be bacterial disease, with the exception of the odd thing. There aren't many viruses which will kill you. I mean, there are a few, well, obviously, recently there have been a few, but in terms of across most environments, if there are a lot of excess deaths, and there are acute febrile deaths, which the vast majority of deaths are, then it can only really be bacterial disease. What happened to bacterial disease over this period of time in Khalifa? So these are invasive bacterial disease. This is meningitis, pneumonia, bacteremia. This is the malaria coming down. This is bacteremia coming down, and this is different sorts of bacterial disease. But the message is that over the same period of time, there's a really dramatic reduction in life-threatening invasive bacterial disease. Now, again, you could say, well, there's just something happening. You know, health services are getting better in the area, and it's making malaria go down, it's making bacterial disease go down. But we now know, as surely as you could know anything, that that isn't the explanation. The explanation is that malaria leads directly to the invasive bacterial disease. And I'm going to say why we're so confident about that. So many of you will be familiar with the story of sickle cell trait and malaria. So sickle cell trait, for those who aren't aware, is protective against malaria. So sickle cell trait means that you've got sort of one normal hemoglobin gene, as it were, and one not. But for those who have the full-blown condition, of course, sickle cell disease, certainly historically in Africa, led to almost universal death in young childhood. So it's an extraordinarily bad thing to have. So the only thing which could raise the prevalence of the gene itself to the level it's at, so in some parts of Africa, more than 20% of children have sickle cell trait, is something extremely protective. And that's well established now that is protection against malaria. So sickle cell trait protects you against death from malaria. And some years ago, for reasons I can't entirely recall, we asked the question, does sickle cell trait protect you against bacterial disease? And we were slightly surprised to find that it had a massive protective against bacterial disease. And we could never sort out, no matter how cleverly we did the statistics, we could never remove the effect or be sure. We tried to take out all the malaria possessional effects, and it was still incredibly protective. It didn't seem likely that sickle cell trait really protects you against bacterial disease, whereas we know it does protect you against malaria. But we were trying to think out how to do this. And obviously, one thing to do will be going to a big study somewhere where there's no malaria. And during the time we were thinking about this, we realized that nature had done the experiment for us, which I've just shown you, because during that period of thinking about it, malaria had gone right down in Khalifa. And this allowed us to perform, and this is work of Anthony Scott and a whole set of colleagues in Khalifa, was essentially a Mendelian randomization experiment using the fact that some people have the tray, some people don't. And we looked every year in a case control study retrospectively, because we sort of see all children coming to the hospital. We are able to sort of retrospectively check who had tray, who didn't, who had malaria, who didn't. And we did a yearly case control study looking at the protective effect of sickle cell tray against bacterial disease, not against malaria. So this is the protective effect of sickle cell tray against bacterial disease. And as I said, initially, very strong effect. And the prediction is that if that is mediated by protecting against malaria, then if you don't have any malaria, you won't have the effect anymore. And that's exactly what happened. So now, there is no protective effect of sickle cell tray in this area against invasive bacterial disease. We've still got plenty of invasive bacterial disease because it's a common condition. So I think this is as close as you can come to proof of causality, that the only explanation can be that sickle cell tray protects against bacterial infection because it protects against malaria, i.e. it is the malaria which is directly causally leading a group of children to have life-threatening invasive bacterial disease. And I always, at this point, sort of think, oh, maybe this is over the top. And I always say to people in the audience, if you can come up with another explanation, we'd be really keen to have it. But so far, anyway, no one has come up with another explanation. So if that is the case, then you come up with the counterintuitive conclusion that malaria may directly cause, in a real sense, half of the cases of invasive bacterial disease. And remember what I said, that invasive bacterial disease is a much more important cause of death than malaria. So you end up with a really counterintuitive idea that malaria causes more deaths due to non-malaria than it does due to malaria. It's a great story, but you can't quite believe it. Well, at least I couldn't quite believe it until this paper came out from Immo Kleinschmidt and a whole group of people working in Bioko in West Africa. And just to run through what this shows you, years 2000 down to 2007, highly malaria endemic area, and then it was decided to have a massive drive to control malaria, mostly through a whole set of things actually, but a lot of spraying, etc. This is the childhood mortality per 1,000 births for these years, 157. So here we're talking about 157 per 1,000. I mean, 157 children die before their 5th birthday, much higher than we're talking about in East Africa. 157, 189. And then for the whole period, 2000-2003, averaging 157. For the whole period after implementing the malaria control, dropped to 55. So again, all-cause mortality is a remarkably similar figure, sort of, around about 70%. But the most extraordinary thing about these data are that it dropped in a single year. And the only thing that happened that year was massive malaria control. So this cannot be due to sort of changes over time in access and et cetera and et cetera. It can only be that it was due to the malaria control. And it fits exactly with what we've just predicted from the data on the relationship between bacteremia and malaria. So hard though it is to believe, it does seem very strong evidence that if you control malaria, you have a massive additional effect on controlling all causes of childhood mortality. Okay, so up to now, you might wonder, why did I call the title of this talk, is the glass half full and half empty? Because it seems to be entirely full. I mean, it's great, loads of money spent on malaria, effective control measures, big reductions in malaria, and even better, big reductions in all-cause childhood mortality. I mean, what can be wrong with that? Well, there are some real shadows on the horizon. I'm not going to dwell on this for time's sake, but I just, many of you will be aware of this. Artemisinin resistance in the Greater Mekong. We depend on artemisinin combination therapies everywhere in the world now to treat malaria. And the idea was that in combination, it would not be possible to get resistance. But of course, it's not always used in combination. That's the problem. Artemisinin resistance has arisen in the Greater Mekong. It was observed around about 2006, but we think probably arose some years before that, probably around about 2000. And now, and this isn't a completely updated map, but is now extensively over the greater Mekong region. Very interesting that this is the part of the world where drug resistance has always started against malaria. It's where chloroquine resistance emerged, it's where SP resistance emerged, and of course with both of those it spread to the rest of the world quite quickly. What's really interesting about the way this, and I kind of hesitate to call it interesting, I mean it is interesting, but it's frightening. But what is really interesting here is this does seem rather different from the emergence of things like chloroquine resistance, because what it turns out is happening is that there is multiple emergence. This isn't spread from Cambodia outwards. There is, in this whole area, multiple emergence going on in many different sites of Artemisinin resistance. But nonetheless, the fact that there are Artemisinin-resistant parasites over an increasing area is worrying. The fact that it's accompanied often by resistance to the partner drugs is worrying. And there's a real possibility that with quite quickly, certainly in parts of Cambodia, you will have malaria which is literally not treatable, not susceptible to any drugs that we have at all. And if that were to spread, as chloroquine resistance did, then that would be an absolute disaster, because there are no new drugs close enough to actually bring them on quickly enough. There are new drugs, but they're not close enough in the pipeline if there were to be a sudden spread of Artemisinin resistance really across the rest of the world. The other problem, which I certainly won't talk about because there are so many people in the audience who will talk about it, is insecticide resistance. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail about this. Like all these maps, the darker the colour, the worse it is. Brown is really bad. But you can see that all across the world, insecticide resistance is a problem everywhere. And in many places, it's really bad. You know, there are resistance to sort of multiple classes of insecticide already. So the two things which we depend on, the drugs and the insecticides, we've got a real problem with, emerging right around the world. I want to now, as we move into the last few minutes, sort of also flag another reason why we should be concerned. And it's an entirely predictable reason. So you've already seen these data from Khalifa, what happened when there's severe malaria in hospital dropping off dramatically. And this needs a bit of explanation, but so if I go back to this, this is yearly data. Now, of course, malaria is seasonal. So if you take a single year, so here, 1990 onwards, if you take any single year, obviously malaria goes up and down. There's 2 malaria seasons. So on the next plot, for each year, we've plotted the average malaria coming into hospital, severe malaria coming into hospital in that year. So 1999, as you can see, there's a lot of malaria. There's more than there was averaged over that period of time, because that's the average. By 2009, here, there's very little malaria at all, and you can see right through the year, hardly anything compared with the historical average. This is 2011 and 12, ticking along nicely, just like 2009, and then suddenly, bang, in the short malaria season, the short rainy season, suddenly an epidemic of severe malaria, right up to historical levels. Not just a little bit, went right up to the level it used to be before. Big difference, this time it's not children of 2, 3, it's children of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, deaths up to 10, because there's immunity has dropped off in the population. Sudden massive epidemic of older children with life-threatening complicated disease. Now this is entirely predictable, because as I said, it's immunity that holds malaria in check. And if you're successful with malaria control, which we want to be, you will reduce the population immunity. And that means that if you have any slacking off at all for any reason, whether it's your reasons, i.e. you haven't done what you should do, or whether it's a biological reason, something changes in the transmission pattern, then you've got a massive problem. You've got susceptibility of a whole population to very severe disease, and you will get massive epidemics. This is what's happened historically. It happened in India, it happened in Sri Lanka, it's happened everywhere where people have almost controlled malaria, and then for various reasons it's slacked off. But we're now, by being so successful in Africa, we're setting up a whole continent to have this kind of problem. If there's any slacking off for any reason at all, forever. This isn't a time-limited thing. It's only time-limited if you eradicate malaria. So where are we in 2015? Well, as I say, loads of good news. Malaria is falling in many parts. Not absolutely every part. There are bits of Africa where it hasn't fallen, but in general, malaria is plummeting. The great news is that you get a disproportionate gain in childhood survival. It's not just the malaria. Everything gets better. So there's been renewed optimism, a lot of talk of eradication. There are new interventions. RTSS vaccine, there'll be a decision on this in a few weeks' time as to whether to use it for public health reasons. It's not a great vaccine, but it's a fantastic development in the sense that, you know, many people would have never imagined you could have a malaria vaccine. There are new drugs in the pipeline. They're not close enough, but there are new drugs. There are new vector control approaches in the pipeline, so it's not all doom and gloom. So there's good news. But there's bad news. Drug resistance is emerging again as a big problem. Insecticide resistance has always been a problem and is getting worse. There is flat and insufficient funding. I made a big play on the fact that funding had risen to $2.5 billion, but we actually think we need about $5 billion a year to even implement the control measures that we have. So, and it's been flat for several years now. So we're kind of in the worst possible position. We're halfway there, not going to completion, and we've seen what will happen if there's any slacking off at all. And there are large populations now, not small populations, with reduced immunity. So the susceptible population for massive resurgence and epidemics is very large. So concluding thoughts on this. I think there's been a lot of debate about elimination and eradication. I think it's clear that elimination and eventual eradication must be the long-term goals. I mean, if you're going to control malaria at all, you have to get rid of it, because if not, you've got a problem forever, and it's a problem which isn't just a bit of a ticking along problem, it's a problem where there will be massive epidemics. But you can't eliminate unless you control. So a lot of the focus at the moment is on elimination in a few countries which are almost there anyway, where by definition malaria is not a problem any longer. And there are often countries which did not have a lot of transmission to start with. That's very different from the situation where you're in a country which did have a lot of malaria to start with. So we absolutely have to focus now on controlling in the places where it's still a problem before we can even think of eliminating, because there's no way you can eliminate without getting on top of the real big problem. And as we said, great reductions, but we've still got hundreds of thousands of deaths a year. So we've got to control first. Historically, many countries have already been to the brink of elimination and had resurgence. So this is not a hypothetical problem, it's a very well-known problem. There is a new global technical strategy from WHO, which was passed by the World Health Assembly this year, and there's a new global malaria action plan, which sort of describes how resources will be brought to bear on this, and they will both launch this year. It's absolutely essential that global funding is increased and sustained, and that new tools are developed. Without those two things, it will not be possible to talk about, even imagine eradicating malaria. Both are necessary. There needs to be at least a doubling of expenditure right now to apply what we have right now. And this is more contentious, but I'm personally absolutely sure that it won't be possible in any sensible time span to talk about eliminating malaria from areas of very high transmission with our current tools. You absolutely have to have a new tool. It doesn't matter whether it's a vaccine or a brilliant wonder drug that lasts forever and is totally safe, or a vector intervention, or whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, but there has to be a new paradigm before you can actually eliminate or eradicate malaria. So I hope I've given you a reasonable and I hope a balanced overview of where we are with malaria. There is some really good news, and I think some really worrying news, and I think that's where we find ourselves now. So I'd like to thank you once again for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a great pleasure to give the talk and to be back in Liverpool, and thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Kevin. And I did ask him before the talk whether he'd be wanting to take questions, but I knew what the answer would be. So please, if there are any questions.
So you talked about this bacterial malaria interaction.
Can people hear okay, or do you want a microphone?
I can talk louder.
There's a microphone.
We know.
I can talk very loud. So you talked about this malaria bacteria invention predating intervention, and you talked about it more unidirectional. Do you think antibiotic rollouts have had any impact, and is this multi-directional?
No, well, it's a complex situation because, of course, childhood mortality has come down in general across the world, and in Africa, in places where there's not as much malaria as well. So there are improvements in child health. Vaccines have been incredibly important. It's hard to quantify whether antibiotics have played much of a role. I'm not aware of any work which has really tried to quantify that, but this is not my area. Vaccines definitely would have had a major effect. So I'm not suggesting it's all one thing at all, but just simply that there is a causal relationship, and when you get rid of malaria, and certainly in the case of Bioko, it's hard to escape the conclusion that it was getting malaria under control quickly, which had a massive knock-on effect. But I don't doubt there are many other things as well.
Question. I can shout as well. There's very compelling evidence of that malaria is a risk factor for mortality from sepsis.
Yeah.
It's very convincing. How does that work? How is
Yeah.
that mediated?
Well, there's loads of possibilities. There's lots of ideas. There's some experimental data from animal models. It's likely to be a whole range of things. It's quite notable that the association is much stronger with gram-negatives than gram-positives. There's a particular association, of course, with non-typhoidal salmonella. There are quite a lot of data showing that, and of course, monocyte function is really, macrophage function is very important for many of these bacteria. There's quite a lot of data showing that malaria can impair macrophage function both physically, just by loading up with pigment, but also through regulatory mechanisms. There's quite a lot of evidence to show that many children may have what amounts to functional hypersplenism for periods during their development. But there are also quite a lot of evidence, from animal models in particular, of other immunomodulatory effects of malaria on T cell function and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying in a long-winded way, and I should have said it more shortly, is we don't know. But we don't. It's not that we don't know and we've no idea. We don't know, but we've got lots of ideas. But we're not sure which is the most important.
With a reduced immunity, you should get also reduced asymptomatic people to infect. So do you think with time, if you could keep it up long enough, that the asymptomatic level would go down so there wouldn't be so many?
Yeah, well certainly what does happen is the asymptomatic level does go right down to a very low level. So now in Khalifa district, on average, whereas it used to be in the 50 to 60% in children, it's now 5%. In some areas it's down below 1%. So that definitely happens. But that last bit is the hardest to do, sort of both in practice through many historical examples and also through modelling. That last bit you can't do. Yeah, I mean, not just by leaving it as it is. You get down to 1% or less, fine. But you won't interrupt transmission completely. And as soon as you get a small tweak in the system, you've now got a massive susceptible population. So you definitely will get what you described, but it won't dwindle away to nothing, unfortunately. It'll always stay there, ready to come back.
You mentioned Sri Lanka and the resurgence they got there, and it took about 7-8 years for that to resurge after they basically stopped. They're back where they were in terms of having got transmission right down, and we're also now nearly 7-8 years into that set. There are two things to my mind that have happened differently. One is that the housing stock has shifted dramatically, and the other is that they've made malaria a notifiable disease.
Yes, yeah.
And I was struck just going through Malawi a couple of weeks ago. There is a dramatic change in housing stock going on there. How much do you think that has had an influence, and how much might it influence resurgence?
I think it's likely that has had a major influence. Whether it's the housing stock per se, it would make sense. I mean, we'd all prefer to live in a good house than a bad house, houses without lots of sort of gaps, and so it would make sense. But again, you'd have to apply the same caution that I did to the association between bacterial disease and malaria coming down, is that it may be a reflection of something else, i.e. it's a signal of something happening in that society. And you can imagine all sorts of things. One of the, when we were first thinking about this, we tried plotting all sorts of changes which would happen onto the timeline, say, well, could it be this, could it be that? One of the most interesting, of course, is to plot mobile phone ownership onto the timeline. But it's telling you the same thing. It's telling you about changes in society. Now, whether it's people's attitudes, their health-seeking behaviour, the houses they live in, or a combination of all of them, which sort of slightly boringly or perhaps slightly reassuringly, I guess, is most likely. I don't think we can say, but I'm quite sure that's right. Its development is playing a major role in Sri Lanka. I think notification in Sri Lanka has been really important. But what strikes me is when I ask colleagues, I don't know if you have the same experience in Sri Lanka, even people in the programme who've been part, you say, what do you think you did that really made the difference? Well, they say to me, we're not sure. We're not actually sure which was the critical thing. They did a whole load of things, and hopefully it's not going to swing back. I mean, it is quite different now to the case sort of when they originally got close to elimination, but it's not for certain that it can't swing back. I'm not trying to imply that will happen in Sri Lanka. I think it's reasonably sure it won't, but it will certainly happen through most of Africa where we're reducing transmission, and is already happening in little epidemics.
So I guess that follows on from my question. Follows on the resurgence you saw at 2011, 2012. Obviously, very brief. Do you have any speculation what's the societal or environmental drivers of that resurgence?
Yeah, no. Again, I have to be honest. We're not totally sure. We think it had been about 3 years since the last mass distribution of Bednets, so it's plausible that it was the wearing off of the insecticide. But to tie it down, the rain was heavier that year. So again, it's probably a combination of a climatic factor. Because these things are, as you know, they're kind of critical systems. You only need a small change to get a sudden effect. So something has happened. It's probably a combination of a bit more rain and wearing out of insecticide is our best guess. But I wouldn't want to be confident about that.
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in your new paradigm that we need, because have we had a situation where we've had good drugs, we've had good insecticides, both for IRS and for nets, we've reduced everything, and yet it's still come back. And does that actually say we don't have enough? Is that actually evidence enough to say we don't have enough to actually get rid of this disease?
Well, so there's a lot of discussion and debate about this. I think right now we don't have enough. If you mean the drugs we have right now, the insecticides we have right now, I don't think we do, because I think getting rid of the asymptomatic population is extraordinarily difficult, and it's fine if you were in a place which had relatively low transmission potential when you started. All the places that have eliminated were pretty much like that. So you can get rid of it completely. That's going to be so much harder when you have a high transmission potential to ever get down far enough. I tried to, when I was saying this, to say that not everyone agrees with this. This is my personal view, but it's also many other people's views. I just don't think it's possible in a potentially high transmission area to get down with good bed nets, even without insecticide resistance, and a good drug. I think you need something else. You need something which will clear the transmission potential, either a long-acting antigameticide drug, which is entirely safe, and which the whole population takes multiple times, or a transmission-blocking vaccine, and it doesn't matter where it works. I don't mean an antigameticide vaccine. I mean anything that's so good that you just don't get transmission. Or you completely screw up the vector population by some clever technique. But I think you've got to have one extra thing in a high transmission area. I think you can get right down to almost nothing, but you're always having to be holding it there at great expense without that extra thing. That's my view of that.
Any more questions? No, then my last duty is to invite Janet to award the Mary Kingsley next.
Thank you very much. So, my pleasure to do this, but I guess going back to Mary Kingsley, because in her book in West Africa in 1898, I think she actually wrote it, asked about malaria and mosquitoes in particular in West Africa. I think her comment was, just keep quiet, keep your head down and hope they go away. Because your chance of actually standing up to a thoroughly difficult African insect are not good. Thank you very much for your talk. I think you've really enlightened all of us the fact that at the moment we can just about stand up to them, but we do need to make sure that going forward we actually improve the tools and technologies that we've got, and there's no room for complacency in terms of where we are. But also I think giving you the Mary Kingsley Medal and the 100th one, I think somebody's supposed to take a picture of it up there, so we're supposed to stand and shake hands over that. There is drinks and nibbles outside in the Nyankundi room for everybody if you would like to socialise and catch Kevin for a little while before we whisk him away and feed him dinner. So please join us in the Nyankundi room.
You're not out of the job. You're definitely not out of the job.
Thanks very much.
Oh, another one.